So during the Super NES days, how big was your department? Like, how big was the company? Approximately during the peak, how many people that were working there?
About 125 people.
Sounds like a
With
lot.
contract, yeah, with contractors on the outside
Yeah.
too, programmers on the outside and artists. Yeah, we were doing a lot of games. We were developing for other,
Right.
but we were doing a lot of internal, and we had acquired games from other companies that we were publishing. So we probably had a pretty good art department. Glenn was our art director who ran that department, and we probably had 15 people in that department. Then we had a programming department with lead programmers and junior programmers and programmers who were still learning the tasks
Yeah.
at becoming, really good programmers. So
So comparing this company back to when you worked at Activision, are there like pros and cons that come to mind about like vis-a-vis like the size or the size of the companies or companies like the advantages that maybe a small company had versus a larger one or anything like that?
it's interesting. When I joined Activision, um, one of the founders um, talked to me at one of the trade shows, and I said, "So how how?" And he said, "I kind of liked Activision when it was just four of us, and now it's got all these people and an Eastern Design Center, and it's really not the same company." And I kind of understood that when we built Absolute Entertainment up. They're just two different type of environments.
Right.
I enjoyed both, but sure, there was nothing like the beginning of Activision where Gary, myself, and three other guys um, kind of, you know, joined Activision, and it was just us from the basement. That we worked in Gary's basement, and we moved on to Activision, and it was really just us, and we were a tight group. We worked together and hang out together. Um, yeah, it's very special, and it's always very special when one guy can sit with a game and create it,
Right.
um, as opposed to a team of 30 or 40 people, or hundreds that it now takes.
Right. Exactly. So just kind of wrapping things up here for Super NES. Do you remember what your favorite games were like in the system? Like which games like really loved?
On the Super NES, well, I did. Excuse me for the phone ringing in the background. I'm sorry. I did always um, love. I have to say, I always loved Super Battle Tank.
Mm.
That was one of our titles.
Yes.
Um, uh, but Nintendo titles were all incredible. Trying to think of some of my favorite games. Um, hmm. Well, obviously Mario World, Link. I mean, although Link was incredible. I played a lot of the first party games. I love the Rare titles.
Oh yes. Yep. Yep.
Donkey Kong Country. Those guys are just amazing.
Right.
Those guys just could do so many cool titles, or so many cool things. Um, so yeah, I mean, I remember um, obviously Capcom and Disney's Aladdin on Super Nintendo was incredible. The Sega Genesis, I think, was a little better. But I was into the Mega Man series. I was into R-Type. Um, I wasn't so much into the sports titles. I mean, I know they were cool, NBA Jam and the other ones, but I was more into the arcadey games.
Right. Yeah.
F-Zero was a very cool title as well.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I would say, of my favorite, um, it's hard to say. I think Zelda's one of the top ones, and I think the Mega Man series was really cool. Um, and of course, Mario. Who can beat Super Mario Brothers? I mean, seriously, that
Yeah. Right.
was you know we enjoyed making our games, but
Yeah.
we enjoyed playing those games better
Oh yeah. Sure. Of course.
before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know you're also big. So you're also like a fan like flight, flight and airplane games. Do you remember playing UN Squadron? That was like a That was that was a Capcom side-scrolling action game with like airplanes.
I do remember seeing that. We had that in the lab. We would buy a lot of competitive games and obviously play them
Yeah.
when we were not, hard at our desk working, or when we were busy trying to clear our head of the current problems we were trying to solve.
Right.
But yes, I do remember that game. I don't recall what the screens look like, but I remember seeing the cartridge.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to check it out. Like, so what are some of your like favorite flight games?
I was into the Amiga. They had a great series of flight games. The FA-18 Hornet. I think
Okay.
that was called on the Amiga. That was a lot of fun. I mean, I was an early adopter of the Microsoft Flight Simulator
Yeah.
when those games came out. I actually took flight lessons for quite a while, so I enjoyed actually flying, and so I would find it interesting to play the games and
Mm.
find out how closely they were to the real thing. Back then it was pretty restrictive.
Right.
We didn't have a lot of processing speed. We couldn't do the type of things people do today. Um, but yeah, as far as flight games, I played what I could on the Amiga, which I remember was the first one where there was a actual first-person aircraft carrier. I think that was on the FA-18 game. And we did some other ones. We did games like on Commodore 64. We worked on Flight of the Intruder, which was a C64 game. I had done a version of Turn and Burn earlier with a programmer on the Game Boy. And then I think the best version I did of an F-14 fighter game was on the Game Boy
Mm.
when I was at a company called Majesco.
Right.
I was actually able to do everything I wanted. Advances.
Yeah.
And they had that wacky, Nintendo had that wacky serial port where you could hook up Game Boy Advance games. And so we had 4-player combat in that.
Oh, cool.
Um,
Okay.
and I remember one of the original flight games that I really, really liked was Warbirds, done on the Atari Lynx by Rob Zadibble.
Okay. Yep, I know that game.
Man, that game was cool. When you connected 4 game systems up, that game just rocked. It was a biplane. It was a style biplane, and you really got a great sense of how the aircraft flew. You could really stall the aircraft out. You could just, that was just a tremendous game, so well written. And I played days and months of combat with other people on that game. That was probably one of my favorite early flight simulators.
So, did you play either back then or more recently B-17 Bomber?
Oh God, yes, on the B-17 bomber, on the I had a love of planes, particularly B-17, which brought me to the Confederate Air Force in the late '80s, early '90s. Actually, fly in B-17. I have a great admiration for the 8th Air Force and knew a number of pilots back then who actually flew sorties in World War II in B-17s.
Cool.
Because having met a lot of the veterans. So yes, I remember playing a B-17 on a television system we had in the office.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't get a chance to play the game like till the flashback came out several years ago, but I was just like blown away by it because it's like to think a game this complicated came out back then was just amazing.
Yes. And it had voice.
Voice, yeah,
One of the
exactly.
first
So,
voice games.
but
Yeah, it was very, very well done. Very
but
well done. I had a chance on a very low budget to do a B-17 game for the for the Nintendo DS called B-17 Liberator, or I think it was called Fortress in the Sky, which was a B-17 game. Had to do it kind of quickly, but I think the combat worked out really well. And what was cool in that game is I used a lot of voice. I used voice actors, so every seat in the aircraft had an AI character, and while you were in combat, the waist gunner, or you could hear the tail gunner, or you could hear the top of the turret gunner, the ball turret gunner, giving commands and yelling. The aircraft is, the target is flying underneath, or coming around to the left side, waist gunner, get ready. And so it was kind of cool in about what was happening outside the sphere of the aircraft.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do remember that B-17 was. I didn't recall that till you brought it up.
Yeah. So you've worked on a lot of systems, over the years, either like programming for it or programming for it, like over super, like overseeing work on it. Do you have like a favorite system, maybe that you were favorite system or two that you really have like strong feelings for?
Well, I gotta say the Atari.
Of course, yeah, of course.
I love writing for first console system, and I get more joy out of writing code on that system than any other system. I had worked on games on the Xbox One, PS2, on the original Xbox. I mean, those are good. I would say, the Game Gear also was a fabulous system, and it didn't have a lot of exposure. But some of those games, that system the architecture was fun, and the graphics are great, and a lot of the games were very fun on it. I had a chance at Majesco to work on Bomberman Red
Yes.
on
Yeah.
that game.
Right. Yeah.
And those are just, it's just a wicked system.
Yes.
I mean, that's Nintendo systems, are always so clean. They're closed systems, not like open architecture. You never have to wait for except for the GameCube. You didn't really have to wait for the games, which everybody always loved, that plug and play. The Game Boy Advance system, I produced over 52 games for while I was at Majesco. If you go to my site at dankitchengames.com, take a look at the credits section under Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, and Nintendo DS. I was involved in almost 100 games on those systems combined. And I thought the Game Boy Advance architecture was wonderful. Very cool display, very cool system, very nice packaged, pocket system that you could take around. I think the Switch is an incredible, Nintendo has done it again and moved on to another incredible.
Right.
They seem to have the below the core gamer market kind of sewn up.
Yes, exactly. So
they've always have, and they just come out with incredibly fun games.
Right.
So I would have to say, the Nintendo systems probably. Yeah, it's interesting. I've been in the business for 40 years. Inevitably, when I sit in front of a system, plug a game in, and I kind of always remember where I was and what that time was. And they're all wonderful individually. But, I'd have to say the Atari 2600 system, and probably the 8-bit NES.
Yeah.
We did a lot of games in that system, and that was just a magical time to see the resurgence of the business we were in, and to see it begin to prosper really well.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, like, the fact that you've been around for so long, like you've seen so much happen over the years, and worked worked on like so many systems. So are you ever amazed that the industry is not only still around, but still around today, but doing as well as it is, considering everything that you've gone through?
No, I'm not amazed that it's. Somebody once said this. I think it was David Crane, or somebody said to me that man will always use his sophisticated technology to entertain himself. And so I knew video games would be around in some form. It's amazing the exponential leap they have taken. I mean, I understand we're 40 years past now, but when you look at some of the games now that are, and I've worked on some that have movie budget with actors. Yep. I've had the opportunity to with Nicolas Cage on Knight Rider. I'm sorry, I think it was not Knight, Ghost Rider. I've had the chance to work on games like Aeon Flux with Charlize Theron. In the 90s, in the middle to late 90s, where I primarily did it was the days of the CD-ROM games, and I did a number of games kind of targeted to the girl category. I had the chance to work with Christy Yamaguchi, the Olympic skater. And then we were beginning to do motion capture. And I was one of the first companies that did mocap, captured her in an ice skating rink, and then created a game on a PC where children could pick various poses from her and create her Olympic style routine, and then sit back, hit a button, and watch it play on their game system like it was a Wide World of Sports ABC presentation, where you would see her glide across the ice with beautiful camera moves and whatnot. And that was kind of the beginning of doing incredible capture in the middle 90s. And now we go to today. It's just, the power of these systems and the talent of the people is, you are creating interactive films. And it blows me away that, okay, 40 years ago, I remember 40 years ago like it was yesterday. We were working with pixels. We were designing games in the 8-bit Atari, and I remember the first characters I was designing was on paper. Writing down the hex code equivalent of what I was drawing on the graph squares. I knew the industry would continue. It's amazing that it has surpassed all entertainment, including Hollywood, and it's a joy for me that it has become such a far-reaching industry that hits everybody's lives, of every demographic, every age these days, and it's just wonderful that interactive entertainment is such a part of life now, and I'm honored to have had some small part of it, in the very beginning of the industry. I certainly not a Bill Gates or a Bill Budge or Trip Hawkins or people that really helped bring this to masses, but I was a small part of a small group of guys that helped at the beginning, and it's just such a cool thing to see, what it is now.
Well, let me spin that question like a little bit differently. As you're probably aware, there is also a huge market these days for what are called retro style games, with like small teams or even in some cases a single person who's making like 8 16-bit style games on platforms like Steam or whatnot. Are you pleasantly surprised by how big that market is these days?
I'm not surprised by how big the market is, but I'm very happy for things like the iPhone that came out and allowed us to do games individually again on a platform that had such wide-reaching an audience. When I was working with my brother, probably 10 or 15 years ago, or a little bit later on, when the iPhone came out, he had done games on the iPhone with just one guy and and they were incredible things that he had done on the iPhone. And then I had the opportunity to make some products in the iPhone, and I was very happy to see, coming from Majesco, where I was doing games with $5 or $6 million budgets, which are small comparatively to some of the games today, and working with massive teams, that there was a platform now where you could do one guy and create a game. And I hadn't thought very much about the Steam platform, but yes, you can do that now too. But most often I would always need, I'm certainly not artistic. Right? But yeah, it's wonderful to see that today you can have games that are played by people that do massive budgets and massive teams, and at the same time you can play a very game. It's great that the industry has evolved.
Yes, I agree definitely because, I think that I've always been a gamer who loves playing all kinds of games, kind of games. For old games like current games, like you said, the market's evolved so big these days that there's room for everybody. So it's awesome. There's awesome that you're still involved with it, and you're still kind of contributing to the market in your own small way because just that somebody some of your skills and talent should be encouraged. So I am glad you are still finding a niche in it in this crazy complicated market that we're in these days.
The one thing I find disappointing, which is also difficult when you're talking about large teams is you don't really have somebody who's the ownership. Um, back then, Activision made a great effort to highlight us as the designer and to give us credit, which is really the primary reason why the four chaps, the four guys, Bob, Al, Larry, Dave, left Atari because they really wanted to have the ability to do their own titles and to do games that they got recognition for. And it's a shame I don't see very much that a lot of the creators today are still getting recognition.
Yeah.
For being an artist, an artist, not simply a graphic artist. And it's harder when you have a big team and you have 25 lead programmers but there's always one guy who is the person who makes the product and is the visionary and helps drag it over the finish, helps instill that creativity, and then and I would like to see people like that noted on the box and in the games as the creator.
Yeah, definitely agree with you because, I think that, I remember in the old days there was a big fight about, not wanting to release who the programmer was. The programmer was just for fear of them being lured away or whatnot, and that finally changed. That finally changed around '83 or so. But it's like nowadays there are a few people whose names do get promoted and will sell products like Miyamoto, or Kojima, but yeah, most people who work on the stuff doesn't get much credit unless you actually sit through the big unless you actually sit through the huge credit screen that pops up toward the end of most games these days. So I definitely agree with you that it would be nice to that would be nice to have more recognition. And at least of indie games, there are a lot of older programmers, who have gone back to doing indie games, there's a whole bunch of XCR people who have recently come out with a whole bunch of adventure style games on Steam or whatnot, and they're using their names a little bit to parlay the project, but they're still working on things now with modern technology that they want to do back then that they couldn't do. So it's so at least in the indie market, it's easier to get recognition. But yeah, with the massive budget games today, you're right. It's unfortunate that the geniuses behind those they don't get more recognition.
Right. Which brings me to my current project. I'm actually in the midst of finishing a game on the Atari 2600 that I actually started in 1983 while I was at Activision right before the infamous crash of the industry. So when you'd like to talk about that, I'm happy to go into some detail on what that.
Yeah, sure. I just had before we get into that, I just had one last question because you mentioned working mobile games earlier.
Yes.
I've heard some programmers say who are still I've heard some programmers say, I think it may be David Crane, I'm not sure, that in some ways it's been refreshing working in a mobile game because it's for the first time since 2600, they're working in a system with very limited hardware and limited processing power, and they're really having to work their magic again to try to get the game to a good game to work like the constraints of the hardware. Has that been your experience too?
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if it was Dave who said that, but I completely concur. It's wonderful to have a system that has some restraints, but you're able to, as I said, one guy sit down and in C or Objective C or HTML5, whatever it is that you choose to write in or use Unity. It's wonderful to be able to sit down and once again have you versus the machine, one guy versus the hardware, and be able to create something that you have conceived in your mind that you want to put on the screen. It's the iPhone really brought that out as a great feature, as a great thing. The thing it did that was really not great is, hey, I used to do this and sell a cartridge for $34, $40. Now I have to sell my game and it's 99 cents.
Right.
So It's really hard, or now it has to be free. And in there has to be in-app purchases, or some other means of monetization through ads or through something.
Yeah.
Sadly, it crushed people who wrote games financially to the point where consumers would say, "Well, why do I want to buy a game? I can play it for free." Yeah,
Mm.
but you don't realize the number of hours and the number of the amount of work that went into that, and that those artists who did that should receive some compensation for their work.
All right.
Um,
Right. Yeah.
and in many cases, the whole financial model that the iPhone brought made it more difficult for us to make a living, but it certainly brought us back to the ability to be one-on-one with a system and have the enjoyment of creating something in a small environment with limitation.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's a great point you make. Also, because the fact that like I do mobile games some, but and you like, and yeah, I think I think all the free to play stuff is detriment because the fact that like people don't, people don't like being nickel and dimed. They'd rather just simply just like buy a game like straight up. But it's a little bit difficult when you have a great game like your great game on there. For example, like Space Invaders versus Arkanoid. I'm not sure if you play that game, but
Yes.
that's a great game. It's $10, yes. But once you buy it, that's it. You have the game. There's no more. There's no ads. There's no bugging for extra money. That kind of stuff. It's like I wish those games were promoted more, and that market did better on the system as opposed to all the free to play crap that's out there these days.
Well, but now free to play also brings another type of designer. When we were designing 2600, it was a different design methodology than the guys who were writing the coin op games, because they were writing games to push people to insert another. So their gameplay was designed to be able to entice people to want to continue the experience by dropping in another coin. And we didn't have that. We didn't have that restriction on the console games, so our gameplay methodology was a little bit. Well, today you have the free-to-play games, which is even another methodology where you want to encourage people to purchase things in the game that are going to help. And of course, there's that whole debate, skill versus purchase. Should I be able to purchase all my powers and levels to a particular area of the game, or should I actually have to work for it? And you have that debate going on in mobile and online games continually. But it's just harder to make money with free to play generally. But if you know how to do it, you can reap incredible rewards. It's just it's unfortunate that the initial ability to sell games, although Steam has continued that, where you can buy games on Steam, and other portals have continued that you can still get a piece of the action, and in many cases more of a piece than you got when you did Super Nintendo or Nintendo games, because by the time you finish the game, you paid Nintendo the entire price of manufacturing up front, and the games were created and shipped on a boat over here. There were so many people involved in its distributor and the retailer that the margins were not very big on those games. The designers or creators who got any royalty usually didn't see anything, and really it was the publishing company that made the lion's share of the money. At least when you do games now on Steam, you're selling it almost as an individual, and net revenues that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get in the old days. So it's all drawbacks on game design methodologies versus the ability to monetize, getting paid for your creativity.
Sure, that's a great point. And that's actually like a very good segue, like your current project, because you mentioned that you're working on a Toys Hunter game. What kind of tools and programs are you using modern day to create like an older game like that?
So in the old days, back in the days when we were in the basement, Gary was doing Donkey Kong, and Gary had worked on Space Jockey, and I was starting Crackbots before joining Activision. We had to create our own, as I mentioned. So what we had done is we had Apple IIs, and you could pop the top of an Apple II, and you had the peripheral slots in the back of an Apple. And Gary went off and designed a 4K board with 4K of RAM that plugged into the Apple, and out of it came a ribbon cable. We would take an Atari game and take out the chip and just have the circuit board, and then solder a chip socket into there and connect it to the ribbon cable that went from an Atari cartridge board back into the Apple onto this 4 RAM board. And so we would write games on the Apple, send them electronically to the RAM board, so download them to the RAM board, and then plug it into the Atari and turn it on and see if it worked. And that's how we did development back then. And that didn't offer us the ability to do any breakpoints or single steps, any debugging. But it was certainly a far ahead from having to burn, 4 or 5 or 6 individual EEPROMs every time you made a change. When we joined Activision, had designed a wonderful box, we called it. It was a blue metal box with an Atari on it. And after we had joined Activision and Apple, when we got the blue box system, we were running off of a large PDP-11, and you could download the code into this that had, upwards of 8K RAM, and turn on the Atari VCS, show you what was in the RAM from the code that you had downloaded. And Bob had written a monitor, much like Wozniak's original app, where it was a monitor, the ability to do single step and breakpoints, and we had a very large, not so large, but like the size of a suitcase, logic analyzer on a cart that we would roll around. And you could roll it over to an Atari 2600, open it up, and then take this large pin clip and actually clip it onto the processor. And you had a little, kind of a little LCD screen on the, much like you would see on an oscilloscope on this logic analyzer, and you could breakpoint the processor at any point in time. So you could say, I wanted to see when this bit in the processor address line was hit, and you had very good debugging with that. Back in the old days, when we were designing games in Gary's basement, and he was doing Donkey Kong and he had done Space Jockey, Gary had designed a peripheral board that we plugged into an Apple II, and we wrote our code on an Apple II and used this peripheral board that he had designed. It was a 4K board that plugged into the back of an Apple and had a ribbon cable coming out that plugged into an Atari cartridge board. And we used that for development in the very early days. We'd write the code in the Apple memory, we'd download it to the 4K RAM board, and then plug the cartridge with the ribbon cable into the Atari and turn it on and see what lit up. And when we moved on to Activision, we were fortunate enough to get a PDP-11 system where all of us had this mainframe that we were writing code on. And then Bob Whitehead, one of the founders of Activision, had designed what's called a blue box system, which was a metal box with an Atari on top of it. And the metal box contained about 8K of RAM. And we would download from the PDP-11 into that blue box, turn it on, and run it off the Atari that was on top of the system. And that wonderful box had all sorts of debugging tools, breakpoints and single steps. And then in the lab, we had a logic analyzer we could wheel over and open up an Atari and clip it onto the processor and be able to do further debugging of what was actually going on in each of the address lines and data lines. So that's the kind of systems we had back in the day when we were writing games initially, and then at Activision. These days, what I use is a simple word processor tool to write the code, and then I use a DOS-based DASM, it's called, 6502 assembler, and then the wonderful tool called Stella, which is just a wonderful, amazing piece of architecture that runs 2600 games just perfectly. I run my code in Stella, and I use all the debugging capabilities in Stella. And it's just incredible that when I first found Stella a few years back, it's like, oh my God, they actually programmed into it all of the errors, all of the quirks that the 2600 had.
Yeah.
That I remember writing on the actual system where, you'd store at a certain cycle and, you'd see something that was a clock or a pixel off where it should be, because when you write to this address at a certain time with a certain missile at a certain size, it's like, oh my God, they actually recreated that stuff. So you'd actually play the most the closest thing I have seen to the actual Stella hardware. And so I'm developing the game on that. The game is actually a game I started at Activision after Crackpots. Gary's released Keystone Capers very successfully. And I had then released Crackpots later in the year of '83. And I wanted to always do a train game because I like railroading. I like railroads. And so I initially put up a display where I wanted to do a little man running along a train. And I had a beautiful background on with cacti and freight cars that kind of bobbed up and down. And I had a little man, and Gary suggested, why don't you put Keystone Kelly up there? So I put in Keystone Kelly, and he would run across all the train cars, and he'd climb down the ladders on the side of the cars. And I was designing what I had envisioned and hoped to be Keystone Capers 2, which I had called Keystone Cannonball. And then the crash happened in '83. And I remember making a ROM of that game and bringing it home in a red Activision labeled cartridge and losing it for all time. And through the years of many trade shows and many classic gaming conventions, I would run into John Hardy and the other guys who own the National Video Game Museum, who used to have a traveling show for the classic gaming conventions of all of their games and their hardware. And I would tell them I had this game that I started at Activision that never got released, and it was based on Keystone Capers. And I remember about the 20th year of telling them this, they kind of pulled me inside and said, "Dan, we think you're full of crap. We've been hearing about this game for 20 years. You can't find it. You sure you'll show it to us one day." And about 2 years ago, Gary had turned me on to this website that was called 8-Bit Workshop, and it showed a website that you could program the Atari 2600 on, and it would light up like a real Atari. And I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. And so I started playing around with that website, and I said, I'm going to recreate that Keystone Capers 2 game I never finished, that I lost. And I started rewriting the kernels and made a screen of the game that I envisioned in my head, that I remembered I did in 1983. Well, about 6 months later, I'm cleaning out my offsite storage, and lo and behold, I'm in there and I pull out a cartridge out of a box, and it was Keystone Cannonball. And I ran out of the offsite. I was there with my significant other. She was helping me go through it. She's actually the one who pulled it out and said, "What's this?" And I said, "Oh my God, that's Keystone Cannonball." And I grabbed the cartridge, ran out of the offsite, and I called John Hardy, who is the head of the National Video Game Museum, who always said that, "Dan, I think you're full of crap." And I said, "John, you never guess what I have in my hand." And lo and behold, he was visiting his mother in Long Island, New York. He initially lives in Texas now. And I said, "John, I have it in my hand." And he said, "Dan, I'm coming over tomorrow." And he came over, and I brought out of my offsite an old VCS that I cleaned up. And he came over, and we plugged it in. And oh my God, the screen lit up. And it was Keystone Cannonball from 1983. I hadn't seen since the day I made it in the lab and brought it home. And you know something? I compared it to the version I had been starting to play with on that website, and my current version looks better than the old one. And I made some announcements, and the press ran some stories, and I eventually gave the cartridge to John, and it's now part of the exhibit at the National Video Game Museum. And I realized 2 years ago that, oh my goodness, there's a whole group of homebrew people still writing games for the Atari 2600. Where have I been? I didn't know this. And I said, I think there's a market out there, because retro gaming, as you brought up earlier, is so big and is back. And so I decided I'm going to use the tools in the current day world, and I'm going to finally finish that Keystone Capers game from what would now be 38 years ago. Yeah. Since I don't own the rights to Keystone Capers, and I don't own the rights to that code, I started rewriting the game using that tool a few months earlier, 6 months earlier, and it's that code base that I have now continued So I'm not using any of the code from Activision because I don't have the rights to it. I'm not calling it Keystone Capers, and I'm not using Keystone Kelly because I don't have the rights to that brand. But I am using a distant cousin of Keystone Kelly, called Casey O'Kelly, who is in the railroad business out west, while Keystone was still dealing with Harry Hooligan at the Southwick's department store back in New York. So the game is now going to be coming out. It's now called Gold Rush, and it is the basic game design from the original 1983 game. You can check it out and see it on my game site, www.dankitchen.com or dankitchengames.com. And the game I'm finishing is going to be released as it would have been in 1983 as an original Activision cartridge. The name of the publishing company that I have is called Tiki Vision, as an homage to Activision, because I like all things kind of Polynesian. And my regular development company that I do a lot of work for people in the industry is called Tiki Interactive, again, because I like Polynesia and things that are Hawaiian. And so I'm going to be recreating the actual experience of a gamer who had purchased an Atari Activision game in 1983. My package is actually done. You can see it on my website. It is very, very much reminiscent of the original Activision games, the style, the look. The game will come out in a cartridge form, which could be purchased in a box with a manual, with a poster. In addition to that, I'm going to have a game club where you can get an Activision-looking patch for the Golden Spike Club. You can see the patch on my site as well. And I'm going to actually create a line of games on the Atari 2600 that call back to the original Activision days, that look like Activision days, that have clubs, that have patches, and that really resonate with players who remember the joy of getting an Activision game and the fun of being part of the clubs. And so I'm rebuilding a small brand of Activision games in Tiki Vision that will be released with the first game of Gold Rush at the end of this year.
Yeah, it's awesome. That's a great story. So it sounds like programmer work on the games like it's proceeding at a pretty good pace.
It is. It's going at a good pace. I have a regular job with my development company. I actually have a studio in India, and we do a lot of artwork for different online games that are on portals. We've done work with a number of the head companies that do mobile games, and so that somewhat keeps me busy. But I have passionately focused on continuing to work on this. I actually was going to do a Kickstarter to fund the manufacturing of the game. However, that I put off for a little bit because of the current corona pandemic. And honestly, I think people really need to keep their money to support their families when jobs are being dropped so quickly, and people have to really find a way to put food on the table. I'm not focusing on at this time on the Kickstarter for the manufacturing, simply because money is needed for people in so many other more important ways because of the situation we're currently going through as a global community. But I will be hoping to get the game out, released this year as a cartridge in a box, or you can buy it as an individual cartridge, or you can buy it actually as a collector's edition, which I will autograph, and you will have some other things that I've put out on my website. For instance, I have a Gold Rush Gulch newspaper that I print or that I put out digitally, that there's 3 versions of right now, or 2 versions, which is kind of a old-fashioned Western style newspaper with hints in the page of the newsprint about the game. So I'll be putting those out as actual little newspapers you can have. And then for the last 2 years of going to different game conferences throughout that time period, I've created trading cards for the game, and I've released one at every game show that I've been invited to as a speaker. And so I'm going to do a line of trading cards for Gold Rush that you can also see on my site. That will be a collector's edition of trading cards. for each of the enemies and each of the objects in the game. And that, of course, you can purchase and will probably be given as a tier of rewards for the people who pledge on the Kickstarter.
Cool.
So it's overall, I'm having a great time writing it. I've got my second game already designed and partially written, which is kind of an Activision game in the style of what Stephen Cartwright would write. You mentioned before Barnstorming was one of the games you had. I actually loved Steve's games. I love Barnstorming. I love Sequest. And the next game I'm doing is kind of it's an ocean liner that goes across the Atlantic. The game is called Bon Voyage, and it's kind of a mix between Sequest and Barnstorming. And it's kind of a game that I think I would have envisioned while I was at Activision again in 1983. So I'm hoping to do a line of games that people will enjoy on this system.
Yeah, I definitely think there'd be some. Yeah, because I definitely think like your name alone is still very well known with the retro community, as I'm sure you know about. And as you mentioned, the 2600 community is still very big. It's amazing just how many homebrewers are still working. They're still working like that market. So I'm sure there'd be a very like good market out there to start games to. Like we're very like you're looking forward to it. And hopefully more modern gamers will be encouraged to give it a look also to see how how games were back then, that kind of stuff.
Right, and I'll be porting the game to modern systems, to Steam, to the mobile games, mobile platforms. I was honored about 6 months ago that someone did a Commodore 64 version of Crackpots.
Oh.
And so they've reached out to me and wanted to do a C64 version of Gold Rush when I'm done. So I will take the IP and put it on the various current systems so that people can see kind of what an old school programmer would create.
So what's it been like going back to working on the 2600 architecture like the first time, like so many years?
It took a little while for me to remember it. Of course, I remember the basics, but then I would sit there and say, I remember we had a code, we had a packet of code that we used to do to be able to horizontally position the object, and I just don't remember how many cycles that took. And so I literally took about a month or two to almost back engineer the system and relearn it. I knew the basic architecture, but when I got into writing the code, I was like, I knew I had a system to do something, and I would have to go back and take a look at it. I was fortunate enough that when John acquired the original cartridge, he dumped the code for me, and there was something I'd done in the original code. At Activision or on the system, you couldn't really have more than two separate objects on the screen without flicker, which is what Atari did to enable doing Pac-Man and other games. And you really couldn't have more than 6 objects on a screen across a horizontal line. I was able in the original cartridge to have 8 wheels on the train that were not flickering, that were solid wheels. And I had forgotten the technique which I had used to do that. So fortunately, from the code dump that John Hardy did, I was able to look back at that and say, oh, I remember what I did. And so going back to the system, it took me a few months to learn the nuances of the code that I had written. But after that, it all came flooding back into my head. And it's, just as if I was sitting now at an Apple II or at a VT100 terminal connected to a PDP-11 in the other room, sitting in my Glenrock office at Activision. It's all pretty much the same thing, and I'm having a great time returning to the system and writing for it.
So what do you think the ROM size would have been for the game had it been released back then versus what ROM size that you're using now?
Good question. It would have been 8K back then. I think we could do 8K at that point. It's around that time, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just go back a little bit into my memory. Dave had done, of course, Pitfall 2. And Pitfall 2 used the DPC chip. Pitfall came out a year later in 1984. I may have been fortunate enough to use the DPC chip because I know that Activision wanted to initially use that chip for other games other than Pitfall 2, but that was the only game that utilized it. So I think I would have probably had a little bit of added RAM and 8K of ROM to come out with the game. But obviously today, in today's time period, boy, chips are so cheap at that size that Crackpots was created with one 4K bank. Gold Rush will now be created with 32 4K banks.
Wow.
So I have 32 times the memory I had in Crackpots. But I still only have 128 bytes of RAM. I'm not using any additional hardware except the regular bank switching that we used at Activision. I do have more banks, but some of the homebrew games today use the DPC chip technology. What they do, I guess, is they take apart old Pitfall 2 games,
Right.
and they use the chips, or they have custom program logic array chips, PLAs, that are coded to act like the DPC chip. And a lot of the guys who do homebrew are using either Atari Basic, I think they call it, or other enhancements to enhance the RAM and the ROM space. I'm writing it old school as if I was just writing with the hardware, no additional support, except that I have 32 4K banks. So that's the difference. Back then it would have been an 8K cartridge. Today it's a 32K cartridge.
And are you hoping to do all the work on the game yourself?
I'm doing all of the work. I'm writing it from scratch. I'm doing all the art. I'm doing all the coding. I'm doing all the audio. It will be a game written 100% from beginning to end by me. No other support, no other artwork, nothing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It sounds like a great passion project. So I'm really looking forward to it.
It is. And if you go to my site, dankitchengames.com, you can scroll down to just a little bit below the top, and you'll see a video of a version of the game, probably that now is about 3 or 4 months old. I need to put a new version up there. Right. But you can see the current game. Back in the 80s, 83, I had a caboose, I had a boxcar, and I had an engine that wasn't done. Currently on the current system, I have something like 40 train cars from all sorts of different styles, and you can go into the game cars, into the train cars, and kind of like in Pitfall, you had the above area for the jungle. Then you could go down into the cavernous area below. I have that where you can go into train cars that are linked together, so you can play above the train, and then pop into a train car and run many screens to the right or left, through a bunch of different box cars and different types of enemies and different types of puzzles going on there.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember I remember when you first announced you're working on this project, you found the game, it really caused a minor sensation in the Toys Center community, because it's like Activision was so close to the chest, like their projects. Nobody had any idea, that dude even started this game back then. So to have this suddenly announcement come out was like a bombshell.
Yes, I did. I kept it close to the vest back then. It was not far enough along to share with Activision. And frankly, when the crash happened, or when we knew the crash was coming, they had soured on the system. There were actually a lot of games that were released after the crash,
right,
that never meant to see the light of day. So John Van Ryzen's first game was Cosmic Commuter,
yeah,
which he wrote, and we shelved because we didn't think it was good enough. Then he went off and did Hero, which was incredible.
Well,
and
he was. Yes, sir. I was just going to say real quick. I disagree. Cosmic Commuter is a great game, I think.
And Cosmic Commuter is a fun game.
Yeah.
But back then, they didn't think it had it cut the mustard, as we say. Also, Bob had done Skyjinx right after Skiing, and didn't think it was good enough to come out, so it sat on the shelf for 2 years. And then when the resurgence came, or after the crash, when they saw there was somewhat a resurgence in the middle 80s, then some of these games came out. Another one was Private Eye, was a game that Bob did that never wanted to be released, but it came out. I actually have another Activision game that I had written that it was almost 100% complete. It was a very it was a wacky game. It was called, we called it the damn game. Where's that damn game? And what it was a screen of a dam, like Hoover Dam. And you had platforms, 3 or 4 across the screen, and ladders, like you see many of the games of that time period. And you at the top of the screen, you had this reservoir with this, of course, the beautiful Activision sunset, had a sun that was glowing and sparkling on the water, and then on either side of that, you had these two big red industrial like red lights, like you'd see in a submarine, kind of the ones encased in gray metal, with kind of a screen around them. And what would happen is the whole screen would shake, like an earthquake, and a little crack would develop, and out of it would pour water, and it was beautifully done, kind of like the way Howard did the band of stuff in Yar's Revenge, where he actually used code to make that middle area that you have to go through, so it looked really cool and fluid as he made it animate. What I did is I used code, and you actually saw the little pixels in different colors fall down onto the platform as a stream of water. And you had to run over, and I used Keystone Kelly in a little yellow slip, like he was the guy on top of the fish box that you would see from one of these companies. And he would run over and press the button, and you'd cement the hole, and the hole would go away. And another one would happen somewhere else, and then two would happen, and you'd be running across the whole screen, cementing these little places to stop the water. And as you were doing this, and as the water was coming into the screen, every scan line of the game from the very bottom started to change to a blue color, and so the water would eventually come all the way up, and you had to go down into the water, and you had little bubbles coming out of the guy's head as you were trying to fix things. And you had to eventually either succumb to the water and have this side of the dam filled up with water, or you were able to keep it at bay for the longest period of time. I actually almost finished that game. Didn't give it to Activision at the time because it was some kind of one of these projects we had worked on that in the lab we had 2 or 3 games at a time that we were playing around with. And I'm not sure if I ever made a ROM of that game. And I'm hoping one day that will be the next headline. That never released game by Dan Kitchen is found in some other one of my storages. But yeah, it was unique that I had a game from Activision that never saw the light of day, that nobody except very few people ever heard of. So yeah, it was a very fun story, and I'm very happy to have it finally have it done after all these years and wondering what if.
Well, you found one game finally after all these years. Maybe that other one that could pop up at some point.
At some point, hopefully it will, and if not, I may actually rewrite it on the Atari after I get this game in Bon Voyage launched.
The gameplay mechanism sounds a little bit like another unreleased 2600 game that I'm aware of, like Save Mary, that Todd Fry was working on, where it's like you're trying to like save a woman by building a platform under her, like above like a raging river as water flows up the screen. So the game mechanic sounds a little similar to that.
Right? Was that? I think it was Save Mary.
Yes. Yep. Yeah.
I remember seeing. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, a lot of the games back then, somewhat drew upon the arcade games. I know that we had seen a game called Apple Panic, or not Space Panic, which was, I think, what I primarily built the game around because it had ladders and platforms, as many of those did back then.
Right. So awesome. Well, looking forward to it for sure. Are there any other projects or things you're working on right now that you want to plug?
I'm actually also hoping to kickstart later this year my first tabletop game, which is called Drive-In, which is a tabletop game where 2 to 5 players are sitting at a 1950 style drive-in, and you're parking your car to get the best position of the screen and to get the most points by creating the longest contiguous line of your car color around the drive-in. And it comes with a little mini game of intermission, and it's also based on a number of classic B movies. And one version of the game, you can actually download an app to your iPad or iPhone and use the trailers from these B movies to actually interact with the gameplay. So you can download, like House of Haunted Hill will be one of the games, and as you're playing, you have these movie cards, and if you happen to park your car when the dice roll says that House on Haunted Hill is on the screen, you can actually replace the cardboard screen with your iPad and actually play the trailer for House on Haunted Hill from the 1950s movie.
Oh,
And
cool.
it turns the whole board game into a miniature drive-in theater.
Yeah, it sounds like a very like unique game idea.
Yeah, so that's one of the games that I will be coming out as my first tabletop game later this year.
Awesome. Okay. Um, okay. I certainly appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this. About the system, like about your other experiences, the game industry, the game industry, like whatnot. It's a pleasure to have you on here. So I appreciate it like a lot.
Absolutely. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here, Greg. I thank you. And I wish you great success with the podcast. It's always wonderful to hear from you and to follow what you're doing.
Well, thank you. So I just kind of had one last question, thinking about like to kind of wrap things up. This is complicated, but kind of answer it. But I'm interested, like hearing what you think. You're somebody who's been around the industry for a very long time. You've seen a lot of it. You've seen a lot of things happen in the industry, rise and fall and rise again, and some of the trends and whatnot. If you had to make an educated guess, based on what you've seen, like experiences, where do you think the industry is going to be going in the next like 10 years or so? What do you think are some of the trends that may happen that may happen with what's going to happen to the video games, like in the years to come?
That's an interesting question. I wish I was somewhat of a fortune teller or a time traveler. Certainly the quality of the graphics is going to increase. I think the games will become even more playable, interactive narratives that will induce a lot of emotion. When I was working in the early 2000s, I had the opportunity to do some games with Hollywood brands and with Hollywood people. And I know that in one setting, Jerry Bruckheimer was getting involved in the games that we were talking about doing, and expressing game scenarios that were almost theatrical, that would really drive the emotion of the watcher or the player, like one does in a theatrical film. I think you're going to see more of that. You're going to see games that really induce fear or love or excitement or suspense. Very much like the Hitchcock movies of that are classic. I think it's wonderful. The installed base is people who are young children all the way up to adults and seniors. I think you'll see more content for the aging baby boomers. That usually brings about more puzzle games, more games that are fun or easy to pick up. I think you're going to see the niche, really hardcore games kind of stay in its own small niche, although it's a huge niche. Don't get me wrong. Call of Duty is billions and billions. But I think you're going to start to see maybe some of the traditional board games be utilizing things like apps, like Drive-In is doing, and like
Right.
I know some of the other cutting-edge tabletop games are doing. And tabletop games, people think of board games. Sure, I grew up playing Sorry and Monopoly and and Life, but as you know, the last 10 or 12 years, it's an incredible resurgence of tabletop games
Yes.
with games like Ticket to Ride and games that are just breaking barriers of all sorts of genres. Catan and all those games are just, my daughter is in her late 20s and she is playing board games, and I think those kind of games will begin to, the people who make video games are that age, and I think they'll start to maybe cross over to digital board games to a point where you'll have traditional games with digital components. And I think you'll just be seeing some of the RPG and board game mechanics coming over more so into video games, kind of like they were doing in the 80s with a lot of the Nintendo games. Those RPG games were great. Those by some of those, Utopia and other those games were just Ultima, and other of those games were just incredible. and I think you may see a resurgence of those stuff in the future.
Yes, definitely. Most of those board games you already mentioned, Ticket to Ride, Catan, and whatnot, they already have been ported over, ported over,
Right, digitally.
right, digitally,
Yes.
right. So it's like because those games are great, but you don't always have somebody physically around you to play them with. So putting
Right.
them, you're putting them online so you can play them against other people, like it's great, I think. So
Right, right. And I'm thinking more along the lines of traditional tabletop games with a digital component.
right,
This is really what I meant to say, which I know that some games, I think there's True Crimes or one of those tabletop games where you actually use the iPhone to dig into the mysteries and be able to research certain clues and certain evidence. I think you'll see a cross of that, and I think you're just going to see, you know, more of the Red Dead Redemption and games that are theatrical like films that people can play, and hopefully there'll be more interactivity in them.
right.
And yeah, it's just, and I think you'll see them more for the general audience and less for just the core game player. Hopefully we'll have film based or games that are like films that'll reach every demographic of player,
Yes.
and not just ones that are the hardcore GTA 3 or GTA players and the hardcore Red Dead Redemption players.
Right. Yes. Yep. Exactly. And also, I think that as the gaming population gets older, video games are very slowly losing that reputation that they had about being just like like losers sitting in their parents' basements like playing games all day. So
Right, right. Yeah, that's kind of gone now with games like Candy Crush and games that average normal people who didn't usually play games got an opportunity to enjoy. I know back in our day, it was kids were playing. My audience was 14-year-old boys who were very finicky, who could make or break a game at any time. Fortunately, now there's a much wider, broad audience there. You have a chance, if your game doesn't appeal to one demographic group, it appeals potentially to another.
plus with the current quarantine situation going on, a lot of people are applying. That's encouraging people to play more games or branch out in other games that they might not do otherwise. So who knows what kind of trends will start after this ends.
And we go back to the saying that I said earlier in our interview that man will always use his most sophisticated technology to entertain himself.
Right. So
And that's what I hope we'll be doing in the future as well.
I agree with you 100%. So thank you very much again, Daniel, for taking the time to talk to me. And to pick your brain about all this stuff. It's been a great interview, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg. My pleasure. And I will be looking forward to hearing other interviews on your podcast in the future.
Okay, hope to have some of them soon. So thank you very much, everybody. Dan Kitchen, I appreciate you being on the podcast with me, and best of luck with your Gold Rush and other future endeavors, sir.
Very good. And remember, you can go to dankitchengames.com and check it out and see what other games I will be coming out with in the future.
Absolutely. So thank you again, and everybody out there for listening. Appreciate it. Thank you very much as always, and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.